Woodrow Wilson once said, "The whole purpose of democracy is that we may hold counsel with one another so as not to depend upon the understanding of one man." Keep this in mind as we discuss today President comedian Zelensky's attempt to woo the global south aimed at broadening support for his country in its war against Russia, and how this attempt, in my opinion, will fail. My name is David Waralu,
And my name is Elizabeth Ann Stewart.
and you are watching Geopolitics in Conflict.
Our show today is sponsored by Noble Gold.
US President Joe Biden has announced a new package of military aid for Ukraine, including ammunition, artillery, and armored vehicles.
President Biden that the United States and partners will help train Ukrainian pilots to fly fourth-generation fighters such as the F-16.
There seems to be consensus. The current climate does not allow a negotiated end to the fighting.
It is only possible to discuss peace when Zelensky and Putin want to discuss peace.
All right, Elizabeth, what is going on with President comedian Zelensky now trying to reach out to the global south?
It's very interesting what he's doing and who he is becoming, I guess, close with or friends with, and who he is completely shunning. Because as we're watching a lot of countries start to really call for peace, it's interesting that there's not very much talk from him at all about peace. Rather, he's on one hand sort of saying he wants peace, but on the other hand, going to other countries and looking for support now from the global south, because he has support from the global west. But the global south, he hasn't really had support from. In fact, a lot of those countries have remained really neutral. So is he trying to turn the global south on his side?
Yeah. And the other question will be, is he doing this with the approval of the United States or not?
Right.
Because
that's a phenomenal question.
Yeah, because we'll have to, by now we all know President comedian Zelensky doesn't make decisions unilaterally. They have to be cleared by Washington and the allies per se. Otherwise, how would you explain for him all of a sudden trying to woo the global south for its support? I think, and this is my opinion, I think that the reason why he's doing this is because he was asked, especially when it comes down towards India, because the West couldn't convince India to stop importing oil from Russia, because India said to the West, we don't care what you think. It's for our own strategic interest. We're going to keep importing oil from Russia.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Did you know that Bank of America is saying that gold will go to $2,200 this year? An all-time high. Invest in a gold IRA with Noble Gold Investments today and take advantage of this rare opportunity to secure your retirement savings. With the experts at Noble Gold Investments, you can ride the wave of gold's historic rise to financial security. This month, they're offering a solid silver 5-ounce America the Beautiful coin with every qualifying precious metal IRA 401k rollover. You can't go wrong with Noble Gold Investments. Hurry and go to geopoliticsgold.com to secure your wealth. Bag a free 5-ounce America the Beautiful coin if you qualify. That's geopoliticsgold.com. geopoliticsgold.com. There is always a risk of investment, and there's no guarantee of any kind.
And second thing is that India, like China, and like some other countries, be they in the Middle East or Africa, didn't condemn Russia because they have a good relationship with Russia.
Right.
And this is where I see it going. This is where I see the reason why he's doing this.
Well, it's very interesting actually, because since the beginning of the conflict, what's happened is Zelensky has asked for more and more money. And I think that that's an interesting strategy, because he's not, it's not like he's asking for outright support. Now, I know a lot of countries can't give him outright support without choosing one side or the other, right? So that's also very clear. But he's been kind of in a nonstop press tour asking
Mhm.
different countries for money. And the amount
Yeah.
of money that he's amassed, the amount of money that has been funneled into Ukraine since the beginning of this conflict has been billions and billions of dollars from all over the West. And
Yeah.
so it's very interesting also to see here because a lot of countries are starting to call for peace. And it's interesting to see the difference in the narrative in the United States because the United States, even at the G7, basically said, absolutely not. We are with Ukraine. We are fighting to the very end.
Or the
Um,
last Ukrainian.
Right. That's unfortunate, which is absolutely horrific. That is a
Which
horrific.
are
I
horrific.
mean, it's
Yeah,
but it's a joke that's floating around the internet right now, to
that's
the
true.
very last Ukrainian. Um so I think it's a very interesting strategy, but it's also interesting who he's shunning. And a little bit later, if you guys stick around to the end, I there's some sort of intelligence, some CIA intelligence that we found, in through some independent journalists that I'd really like to take a deep dive into because it really matters if it's true.
Mhm.
We don't know if it's true, obviously, but if it is, I think it matters a whole lot.
Yeah. Well, usually for this independent journalist, I'm a little familiar with him, given my time in Washington, D.C. His credibility has been built upon being on target regarding his information.
Mhm.
And his sources are deep inside the government, on both the Pentagon, the CIA, or the intelligence community writ large. This independent journalist has been around long enough.
Well, and we'll give you guys a link at the bottom. But
Yeah,
anyway, let's take a look at who specifically in the global south he is courting because there are some people that he's courting and
yeah.
some people that he's shunning.
Well, the idea of, for example, in India, when you think about India, why is he approaching India but not, let's say, another country? Like I said earlier, because of India, it's the interest that the West wanted to pull India away from that relationship with the Russians. Because
Right.
remember, if you look at history, Russia has stood back then. Soviet Union has stood by India when it comes down to its tensions with Pakistan at the same time, because Russia is considered one of the top weapon suppliers for India. So,
Mhm.
and when India made the decision that sort of challenged the West, when the West asked India to stop importing oil, India's answer was no. Yeah.
Right.
Because they made a mistake. India made a mistake, in my opinion. Back in 2015, 15 or 16, somewhere like that. The United States asked India to stop importing oil from Iran, and they did.
Mhm.
So now they realized they can't do that. It's because their
Right.
economy also depends on energy, and that is the reason why they said no. So this is why I'm leaning more towards having that the conversation was with Zelensky to say, hey, we want you to reach out to India, see if you can woo India to our side and create a wedge between India and Russia. That is one of the
That's
reasons why he did that.
And that seems very reasonable, especially, but it's actually interesting. So, like what you were talking about with, with India not stopping buying oil from Russia,
Mhm.
because that was even in this conversation. So, some of the breakdowns of the conversation between Zelensky and Modi. So,
Yeah.
they talked about humanitarian help. So, India's readiness to continue giving them humanitarian help for the people of Ukraine, which I
Mhm.
I think is critically important. I think that supporting the people of Ukraine is critically important because those people are. I mean, it's a horrible situation for them. They're the ones that
Yeah.
are caught in the middle of this, right? So they talked about that, but it was Modi also made it very clear that they were not going to stop buying oil from Russia because what they're doing is taking care of their own country. They're taking care of themselves. So it's also interesting that India's fuel purchases from Russia were not discussed in Saturday's meeting. So this is according to Reuters. India's fuel purchases from Russia were not discussed in Saturday's meeting. India's Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra, I hope I pronounced that correctly, told reporters. New Delhi says it's defending its own interest in buying Russian oil. So I wonder if that just wasn't something that they knew Modi was willing to budge on, but that they're trying to build step by step that relationship with India, because India is a BRICS nation. And although we don't have perfect alliances between the BRICS nations, it does seem like we have some kind of alliance. Really, the BRICS does mean something, even if it doesn't mean everything.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But the idea of how, for example, India's dependency on the deals that it cut with Russia vis-a-vis the oil, and this is where I believe, again, and I could be wrong, but the way I read it, politically speaking, the way I read it is that what the West wants to achieve by using Zelensky approaching India is to undermine, because they are afraid. This is where the West is thinking thinking that India could undermine Western sanctions on Russia. And how so, you may ask? Is because as India continue to import oil from Russia, Russia will continue to benefit from energy revenues. Even though we did a video on talking about how now Russia is accumulating so much rupees that they're going to have to figure out a mechanism by which to fix this trade issue, which I'm sure they can come up with. There were two, by the way, while I'm thinking about it, because I read the comments of our viewers, and there were some very interesting comments I had a chance to read, and there were two good suggestions that really make a point, and I couldn't agree more, because the comments were in the sense of, well, if India wants to resolve this issue with Russia, why don't they just buy or use gold, or decide on the Chinese yuan currency and bypass the whole thing, which make more sense. Yeah, that's how I see it. So this is where I see the reason why West is hoping that they can pull India away from Russia. But I don't think so they're going to succeed.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up, David, because it really does seem like right now, because the Western media seems to play it as if everybody feels the exact same way about the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. And I think the thing that everyone can agree on is that the Ukrainian people are the ones who are suffering the price of this. And, the Ukrainian people, along with the amount of money that's being funneled from other countries into the Ukraine, it's causing some real suffering globally, especially towards those people. And so I think overall, everyone is kind of agreeing, the suffering's not really okay. It's really sort of time to promote peace. But, the Western media is talking about it like everybody feels the same way about Russia that the US's stance is. And the reality is that that's not true. And I think it's important to note who doesn't agree with the US in their stance and who does, because the Western world agrees, right? So the Western world, the UK, the G7 agrees with, agrees with the US stance, obviously. But there are other countries like India, for example, and in a second, we're going to talk about Brazil that doesn't. And so there are a lot of countries that have been neutral, and then there are a lot of countries who have sided with Russia. And, I want to say this again. I don't agree with what Russia is doing. I don't feel that causing war is ever an answer, ever. Yeah. But it's interesting to note the different takes on what's happening here, because even the Arab summit that Zelensky just came from, even they are looking at it as okay, well, so here's what Zelensky has to say. Here's what Putin has to say. Let's give let's give a platform, let's give a voice to everyone so that we can resolve this.
And by the way, Zelensky was flown from Saudi Arabia to Hiroshima, Japan, to attend the G7 on a French plane. The French sent their aircraft to send him. So I just find that very, very interesting how French volunteered to flew him over to Japan and so forth. So, but I want to bring up a point here that as we talked about how the West now is kind of trying to figure out which countries are in support and which ones are not, and so forth. I'm reminded of when the late Nelson Mandela of South Africa was president at the time. When he was asked, you know what he was asked? He was asked by journalists as to why he still has a relationship with two individuals. One of them was Fidel Castro of Cuba, and second one was Yasser Arafat of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Well, interesting that those leaders were branded as some sort of bad actors on the international stage by Western powers at that time. So what the Nelson Mandela, which he was revered by many around the world, given his history of what he suffered at that time through the apartheid, he replied that it was a mistake, and I put this in quote here because I found it, a mistake to think that their enemies should be our enemies, end of quote.
Oh,
You can,
wow.
you can just see. So this stance in itself, has largely typified now some African nations' response. This is why you have in African countries collectively are kind of pushing against the US, because most of the global South, including Africa, did not vote with the United States at the UN when they were issuing the statement as far as the condemnation of Russia's so-called aggression. This is why you see now across the continent in Africa, or the global South, that is, many countries really appears to be sort of not hesitant, that they took stand of not wanting to condemn Russia because they do have a relationship with that. And I found this very interesting, how historically speaking, here we experienced something similar to that outcome when even the late Nelson Mandela himself was asked.
Wow, that's so interesting. I didn't realize that he had said that. Nelson
Yeah, he
Mandela
did.
was a great man, but it's
Yeah.
very, very interesting that he said that. And I don't want us to be, declared pro or anti anybody.
No, 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 no,
It's
no.
not
No.
about that. It's about finding a way to communicate and to find
Yeah.
peace.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting that you say that, because it is, we've got some very weird dividedness in the world right now. It's not weird, it's interesting. Some very interesting dividedness in the world right now. And I think it's actually very important for, people, especially in the United States, to understand that there is this division. I feel like one of the biggest problems that we have here, on the internet in general, but certainly here in the United States, is that if you disagree with someone, that person is wrong, just completely wrong. There's no validity in their point whatsoever. They're just absolutely wrong. And if they're wrong, we have to just get rid of them. Right? Like, if they don't feel or agree the same way that we do, we just have to get rid of them and not listen to them. And they're terrible people and they're dangerous and they're evil. Right? But that's not how communication works. Communication is, whether you agree with someone or not, you respect them as a human and you listen to what they have to say and come to some sort of agreement. Anyone who's ever been in a relationship knows that it's compromise.
That's true. That is true.
That you
Well,
find
this is
the
why.
middle
Yeah.
ground.
Yeah. Well, this is, don't get me wrong here. And for our viewers, not all countries are on the same page. That's expected. Even in Africa itself, it has been since the beginning of the conflict, widespread condemnation of what's going on in Ukraine. And you look at, I have three countries in mind, like, for example, Ghana, Nigeria and Kenya. They've been sort of, they expressed their condemnation of Russia's actions in Ukraine, and
Mhm.
they are entitled to their stands, whatever, for whatever reason. But that does not mean all countries will have to go with what the West is hoping for. That was the whole point of why we decided to share what Nelson Mandela, the late Nelson Mandela, said back then. Now, to put this within the big picture of why Zelensky wants to woo the global South, I still don't believe it's gonna work. It's not going
Mhm.
to succeed because the global South now starting to, it's already been, it's nothing new, but more and more they are now wanting to be disengaged from dealing with the West headed by the United States, because they are seeing how, what type of policies, for example, and we'll say it straightforward here, what type of policies we embark on when we go to other countries versus what other countries do when they decide to enter into cooperation, economic one, that is. That is the big difference that the global South is moving towards. And the second point to that, if I may add this, is that it is my belief, and it has been my belief for a while, that I argue that the new geopolitical landscape, how it's going to be managed, it's not going to be managed and directed by ideology, but rather by economic blocks. This is why you're seeing the role of BRICS, for example, the role of the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the role of the RCEP, the role of the ACO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations. All this, the African Union now, that is, countries are trying to get together and figure out a way of how they can work together. This is what I believe what's going to shape the trajectory of the new geopolitical order.
Well, and it's really interesting that you're bringing that up, David, because especially
Yeah.
economics. So, when we're looking at what happened during the G7,
Hmm.
one of the big things, so it seems very clear that two things were very predominantly talked about, and that is Russia and China.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, of course.
right. So there's a very, very large conversation about economics, because you're right. For a long
Hmm.
time, at least it was under the guise of ideology, right? The guise of democracy everywhere. But now we're really looking at a lot of these things coming out as it's not ideological, it's economic in nature. So here are some of the things that came out of G7 that I thought were particularly interesting in the way that it was handled. And that is, so this comes from, let's see, this comes from Reuters, I think.
Okay.
So, worried by the outsized role China now plays in supply chains for everything from semiconductors to critical minerals, the G7 issued a communique that set out a common strategy towards future dealings with the world's second largest economy. But they warned that countries attempting to use trade as a weapon would face consequences, in a signal to Beijing over practices Washington says amount to economic bullying.
Wow.
So that's particularly interesting, don't you think? Because they're addressing directly the economics, and they're addressing directly what they say is economic bullying and using
Yeah.
trade as a weapon. But I would like to point out that sanctions are one of the biggest tools used by the United States as a consequence for other countries. So
Yeah.
I'm not saying, because there's a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly, that I'm still up in the air about. So I'm not saying that I
Mhm.
really believe that China has, the world's best interest at heart, because I don't think that. I think they have their own interest at heart. And
Well, they have the right. Don't they have the
right,
right to pursue their own economic interest like we do? It just
right.
they are doing it differently. They are doing it through economic ventures, not wars and conflict and so forth. I mean,
Mhm.
let's just face it. And again, we don't speak on behalf of China here.
Oh my gosh,
I'm
absolutely not. Absolutely
yeah,
not.
I'm
Yeah.
just presenting the facts as they are. Let's look around the world. how many bases China has.
Mm-hmm.
There's one, at least to my knowledge, which I
Yeah.
saw it with my own eyes in Djibouti. It's a small naval spot there, very, very small. I was there, I saw it. In
Mm-hmm.
comparison to how many we have, we have about 756 around the
Right.
world, 758, if I'm not mistaken. So we gotta call spade a spade. But again, at the same time, China's not gonna be doing. In the case of the BRI, it's not going to be just because it cares about the world. No, it just wanted to promote its own economic that will benefit China, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, other countries going to benefit from it. China's not putting the gun to this country's head and said, you're going to have to agree to take the loan from us and do this and do that. They're not. They're giving you the choice.
Mm-hmm.
But it comes with the responsibility. If, for example, you come to me and said, I'm going to give you a loan to get involved in this. If I can't afford it, I should tell you, I'm sorry, I can't afford that. I'm not going to take it.
Well,
that's to me the way I see it.
That would require a very responsible government in which there are not many, I think, throughout history.
You got my point. My point, Elizabeth.
Right.
That's it. And this is where I put the question about the relevancy of G7. You think about it in terms of the big picture. G7, when it started, was mainly guided or geared towards focusing on the economic developments of the Western markets and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Then all of a sudden, you hear something like this in the communique. This is why I take an interest in reading the final statements of any summit. And I've been doing it for years. This is nothing new to me, And this is where I look at, and also I will read comments of, like in this case, of countries targeted, in this case, in Russia. I had to read the statement issued by none other than the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and it became the idea that, as he called it, double containment, meaning you double on two countries, China and Russia. And as a matter of fact, he wrote, and I'm going to share with you guys this one here. He said, and I quote, "The task was set loudly and openly to defeat Russia on the battlefield, but not to stop there, but to eliminate it as a geopolitical competitor." End of quote. That just shows you right there. It becomes a little bit you start to question the relevancy of entities like this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no different than for NATO. The question started to emerge once the Soviet Union ceased to exist, because the next question that came up was, what will be the role of NATO now that the Soviet Union ceased to exist?
Yeah.
And nobody could come up with the answer. All of a sudden, we found later on that NATO is getting involved in some other aspects that have nothing to do with the purpose of why NATO was established in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I see this trajectory going. Just to tie it back to Zelensky's approach in Global South, this is where I see that trajectory, the geopolitical one that is going to be geared towards a trajectory that will be completely on the opposite end of what the Western Hemisphere is hoping for. Because that's why we call it a global geopolitical shift.
Right.
And it's not shifting in the favor of the US, but rather is moving towards the East.
Well, and I also understand, the United States is trying to take care of its own interests too. So, as we're talking about this, you can never make everybody happy, right? So we get comments all over the place. But the reality is that we're just looking at this from a global perspective, from a global standpoint. And the US is trying to take care of its own interests also. It's just, how do you go about trying to protect your own interests? Do you do that through trying to destroy someone, or do you do that by trying to build someone up? But I would like to bring up, in terms of China and what they're doing economically, it's one thing to have a military base. It's another thing to own the airport. It's another thing to own the shipping ports. So
Mhm.
if China owns the shipping ports and they decide you don't particularly like, or something they don't particularly like, and I'm not saying they'll do this, I don't know that, but
Mhm.
it is possible that they can take that port back, at least until
Yeah,
that
but
loan is
hold on,
paid
hold
off
on,
or
hold
whatever
on,
the
hold
term
on,
is.
hold on a second. I'm going to challenge you on this. But
Oh, I
first,
love it.
no, 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 hold on a second. Well,
Yeah.
because I got to challenge you on this. Here is the thing. Here's the thing. At first, China, when they introduce the project, they do disclose the terms. So the
Right.
country can either accept or not. And I'm going to give you a real life example on the ground where I'm at. The
Okay.
country I'm in Morocco, it was supposed to be a project by China in the north city of Tangier, which is on the cross of Gibraltar to Europe. Okay, China provided the money and everything, and they said we will take 50% of the project. Okay, the Moroccan government turned it down. They said no. And what did China do? They said thank you, and that's it. No harm is
Mhm.
done. This is where the difference is the idea of China's not forcing the countries to do. You take
Right.
another example in Africa. You take, for example, either Sudan or some other Kenya, for that matter, whatever, where China built airports. Well, it
Mhm.
built airports because it entered into an agreement with those countries,
Right.
and they
Right.
agreed to it. As a matter of fact, recently, China has renegotiated the term to make it a little easier for those countries.
Right. And
To the
I do
point,
know that. Yeah.
yeah, well, then we gotta give them a credit. We gotta give them credit for that. Do
Definitely.
we do this?
Definitely.
Do we do that? No, we don't.
Right.
Look just how IMF and World Bank are strangling countries. Pakistan is
Yeah.
being the last example. Argentina
Right.
is another one. Now
Sri Lanka.
Bangladesh, yeah, Sri Lanka. You
Mhm.
got the idea. So this is why I believe, again, why China reached out to the Central Asian countries, the five: Tajikistan,
Mhm.
Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And Kyrgyzstan, why? It's because they are realizing that China and also the geographical location, that's going to be the hub for economic. But China is not
Mhm.
forcing those countries to enter into an economic deal with them. If they want to, more power to them. If they don't want to, more power to them.
Right.
Yeah, no different again than another example in Asia itself. You look at two countries. You look at Philippines and you look at Singapore. Okay, look what Philippines
Mhm.
just did. Look what Singapore just did. Well, what Singapore did is they made it clear that they are staying neutral regarding the tensions between the US and China. What did the Philippines do? They decided to open up 4 more bases for the United States,
Right.
sacrificing their economic trade with China. As a matter of fact, for Philippines, it depends a lot on China's market. Australia did the same and ended up shooting itself in the foot.
Right.
Yeah, so that this is where I see that some of us in the West, we kind of, when we present the argument, we only present it from one side. Let's, as you
Absolutely.
yeah, as you said, let's put the whole thing on the global level and figure that out how it ought to be managed. I'm aware of how, for example, we approach our foreign policy, if we ever have one to begin with, towards other countries, especially through, for example, IMF and World Bank.
Right. And I don't
Yeah,
think anyone's gonna argue IMF and World Bank are out there doing a whole bunch of good. I mean,
you're right.
we've watched the defaults, we've watched the chaos that's thrown countries into.
Yeah.
Um, what is it? Diary of an Economic Hitman. What is the book? I forgot the name.
Oh, I know which one. I
It's
couldn't
the
think of it.
Economic Hitman book.
I
It's
know which
very,
one. Yeah,
very interesting. If you guys haven't
very.
picked it up, check it out. It's a very, very interesting book, and the author himself is even more interesting than the book.
That's
So,
true.
and we've watched it, right? We've watched it throughout history, especially some of these
Yeah,
smaller countries and
yeah,
how indebted they are, and
yeah.
that debt seems to make no real sense when you look at it. So, I first of all, I really love that we don't exactly disagree, but I think we have a little bit, I look at things from an economic standpoint in terms of, that's my degree is global business, right? So I look
Yeah,
at it in terms of what does the effect of business have on that country, because it's hard to it's impossible to separate economics from policy, right?
that's right.
Policy is built around having the best economics, best is a relative term, right? But having the economics that serves whoever's in power the most in a
Mm,
country.
mm.
And so for me, I do look at what China's trying, or what China has done. And
Yeah,
in a sense, it has made very, very good investments. It has made investments that have turned out very well for it. Not all of them, right? So, like Evergrande, we see
of
some
course.
foibles,
Yeah,
but I can tell that the rest
yeah.
of the global West is very concerned, because they're saying it. They're saying our biggest concern with China right now is that they are becoming an economic powerhouse that rivals us in terms of power globally. And
Yeah.
people unfortunately don't like to share power,
Mhm.
which I think would actually create a better world if we did work together and if we did share power. But clearly, here in G7, the US is very clearly stating that what they're afraid of with China isn't war. What they're afraid of with China is that they're too economically powerful, and that they will start to dictate what happens globally and shift that balance of power,
Well, that's just part of the development. We did the same after World War II.
right?
So maybe that's now is China's turn, except that China's going to approach it differently. And here is the thing. For China, it took it only about 3 decades for it to arrive to where it is today. And that's something
Mhm.
we are, because here's the thing. We are not accustomed to a different order of the pack. We've been always at the top of every packing order till now. Things are
Mhm.
changing. And what's at the core of it is that we are, and I'll say it straightforward, because I don't care if people don't like it, too bad. It's we are not capable of competing with China. That's what's at the heart of it. That concern is translated into failed policies, like you said earlier. It would have been better if we cooperate instead of creating. And the reason why
Yes.
we're creating
Yes.
tensions is because we want to slow the momentum. That is what's at the heart of it. And some of us in the West do not want to admit this. I mean, look what we did to Europe. We screwed Europe over because we didn't want Europe to get closer to Russia, economically speaking. So we can sell the gas to Europe at 10 times the price. That is the reason. To me, it becomes like, well, if China's working hard to be where it is, then so you either compete with it, work with it, or leave it alone. When we
Right.
became the leader of the global order after World War II, nobody stepped in and said, no, we're going to be the one. Of course, the world was divided into East and West and so forth, but we dominated every aspect of global order per se, and,
Mhm.
and, and set up the dollar to become the dominant currency in the world. Well, that era is coming to an end, and we're having a hard time accepting that reality, let alone understanding its ramification moving forward. That's where I see the challenge.
Well, and I agree with you completely. I think it's like I think it's also coming to an end. And I've talked to people who don't see that, who don't think that, who think that, the United States is always
Mm,
going to stay the hegemon. However, I can tell you that the
yeah,
United States is afraid it won't, based on what we're
yeah,
looking at here, based on what's coming out of this summit of G7, is that the United States is concerned that it's not going to stay the global hegemon. And and
yeah,
it's true. I understand why the US is fighting to stay on top. People don't people it would if the United States is not on top, it changes the quality of life, right? And we are so heavily indebted right now. We're even, we have this debt ceiling issue that is a huge issue that used to come up every so often and now is coming up more and more and more frequently. So we're having some real problems here in the United
Yeah.
States, and it changes our ability to deal with those problems. If we're not the reserve currency, for example, it changes our ability to deal with that, to deal with the massive amount of debt that we have, the unfunded liabilities that the United States has. But I think here's where I think you and I fully agree that the way that they're going about it and being combative about it
Yeah.
isn't going to work. It's not going to
Yeah.
work long term. You can only fight for so long before people get really tired of it. And so I think that's
Yeah.
bad policy.
Yeah. And second thing, we created that failure. So why are we going and blaming others when we created the problem? So to me, it will make more sense if we look inward and resolve the issue ourselves first. Instead of pointing fingers at others, well, I blame you for my shortcomings. I didn't force you to embark on that. You did it yourself through your own failure or your failed policies and so forth. And this is where
Right.
I see that challenge that's going on between the US and China. I do have the concerns as a geopolitical analyst. I do think of the dark side of where that could go and the direction that it will go. I am
Yeah.
hoping that some cool heads will prevail, especially in the West, and think logically and rationally, because China today is not a China of yesterday.
Right.
And that's something we are not willing to accept yet. That's where I see the challenge.
Well, and the United States, like you said this earlier, the United States caused this problem. I remember,
Yeah.
when I was growing up, there was a conversation here among the people of the United States that was basically like, don't send our jobs overseas, keep them here. Keep manufacturing here in the United States, keep the jobs here in the United States. But to cut costs, they were
Yeah.
sent to China. And so the people then that were the very, very intelligent people then were basically saying, if we move all of our manufacturing out of the United States, it will never come back. And, but nobody listened. Nobody listened to that. So we shipped all of our manufacturing over to China, and they got really good at manufacturing. They
Yeah.
got really good at making things. And so now we couldn't move it back to the United States if we wanted to, much less find people to fill those jobs. But we couldn't do it here if we wanted. And it's
That's true.
because we didn't invest in that infrastructure. And so we're in a very challenging place, but the way to handle it is absolutely not conflict, it's cooperation.
No.
And there are those people who believe that the only way to solve any problem is conflict. But with nuclear war, how far can you escalate conflict without destroying everything?
No, that's true. I am hoping some cool heads will prevail down the
Me
road.
too.
Maybe, I don't know, the next administration might have some really interesting people. But again, our system is when you only have a choice between two political parties, then what's the point? It's kind of
Right.
two faces of the same coin. Both Republicans and Democrats are the same anyway. It's just
Yeah.
they approach whatever issues differently, and I care less for both anyway. That's the whole idea of it, and it's because there is no strategy. There has never been a strategy for the last 30, 40 years, and we seems to be just reacting to events as we move forward. And that it's not a good. It's a recipe for literally a recipe for disaster moving forward, politically and economically. That is so. I mean, the debt ceiling talks right now already failed. Just yesterday, it was the meeting between the Speaker of the House, McCarthy, and the President. It didn't move an inch forward.
Right.
With this luck, I don't see how it's gonna work out, but we remain hopeful because that's one of the things we always hope for is to remain positive and remain hopeful that it would work.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Have, hope that cooler heads will prevail and
Indeed.
they'll really be instead, because this is a really big problem here in the United States where it's like this
Mm.
side is, has all the answers or this side has all the answers.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is that most people fall in the middle. And most people know that you actually have to have conversations with people. You actually have to come to an agreement that works for both parties. Anybody who's lived life, anyone who's had friendships or relationships or had children and had to deal, you have to come to a mutual agreement. And somehow politicians think that it doesn't have to work that way. Somehow
Mm.
politicians think that the only way is their way. And it doesn't matter which they are. Both of them seem to think the only way is their way. And we're looking at that actually with Russia and Ukraine also, because it
Yeah.
does seem like both sides are basically saying it's my way or it's my way. And there doesn't seem to be any real concerted effort by either side
Yeah.
in my observation. It's not
Yeah.
just Zelensky, it's also Putin that I'm seeing not being willing to really waver on anything. And both sides are saying, well, it's either my way or my way. And it's that the rest of the world, everyone's in a different spot, right? But more and more we're starting to see other
Mhm.
countries saying, stop this madness. Come to the table, find peace. This isn't the first conflict like this in history. And the people who think that it is
Yeah.
haven't read history. How many battles over basically, territory, more or less, have happened over the course of history? Now, I understand it's more complicated than that. And I understand that there's a very long history, but there are a lot of places that have very long histories. I think it's worth diving into Seymour Hersh.
Yeah. The independent journalist. Yes. He's very insightful.
So, speaking of what we're talking about right now in terms of, finding peace, because I think the big question on a lot of the world's mind and the global
Mm.
south, like you're talking about, David, a lot of the global south's mind, but also some of Zelensky's neighbors apparently are also starting to question this. Okay, so this is from independent journalist Seymour Hersh. So this entire article is interesting. If you guys would like to read it, we'll post a link in the description box. But specifically, he talks about Zelensky's neighbors wanting this to end. So this is a quote from this article. Weeks ago, I learned that an American intelligence community was aware that some officials in Western Europe and the Baltic states want the war between Ukraine and Russia to end. These officials have concluded that it's time for Zelensky to come around and seek a settlement. A knowledgeable American official told me that some in the leadership in Hungary and Poland were among those working together to get Ukraine involved in serious talks with Moscow. Quote, Hungary is a big player in this, and so are Poland and Germany, and they're working to get Zelensky to come around, the American official said. The European leaders have made it clear that, quote, Zelensky can keep what he's got, end quote, a villa in Italy and interests in offshore bank accounts. Quote, if he works up a peace deal, even if he's got to be paid off, if it's the only way to get a deal, end quote. Well, what do you think of that, David? What do you think of the idea that those countries are actually trying to get Zelensky to find peace?
They're not going to succeed. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. They're not going to succeed. The U.S. holds the key. That's the bottom line to it. Because if he goes off track or goes out of line, the end of Zelensky is not going to be pretty if he crosses the line. So that's the way I see it. It's because this conflict was structured in a way that is meant to be dragged for longer period. This is not a 1 year, 2 year thing. And I'm starting to see the signs already, and especially now with the F-16 delivery, we all see where it's going. So, like I said, it takes about 3 to 4 years to train a pilot to fly an F-16 comfortably. So it becomes clear to me that we'll be looking at least the next few years. That was the same thing. That was personally I said about, for example, when the problems in Syria, why I was kicked out of the Arab League when they start the demonstrations back in 2011. I said, well, you will be looking at about a decade from now. And here it's just been readmitted last week to the Arab League, which is after 13 years. The problem in Ukraine is complicated. It's because once NATO gets involved, then you're looking at Russia, NATO, or Russia, US, and it's gonna elevate the level of what's gonna be used as far as weapons. Forget about the basic stuff. We'll be looking now at sophisticated, and that brings a risk with it, a risk to everybody, not just the involved parties. So, and this is why I'm thinking, okay, why is he courting the global South? Well, global South, it's not going to buy the argument. Global South are seeing where the trends are headed. We think that global South, just because they are not as developed as, let's say, Europe and so forth, but they're smart enough. They can see what's going on, and they can see also where the trends are headed economically and geopolitically. And they want to secure their own interest. Do you blame them for that? No. And that's the right thing for them to do as well. So they're going to go where their interests are. India's doing the same, because the reason why they're getting their oil from Russia, they're getting at a discount. That is the reason why. Turning around, of course, and selling gas to Europe. That just Morocco's doing this. Tunisia's doing that. China's doing that. They're selling. Saudi Arabia itself is buying oil from Russia at a discount price and selling it to you. It's interest. It's all about strategic interest or national interest. That is, that's the bit about it. So I hope it will work out, but I just have my doubt.
Well, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But it's very interesting how the global leaders are, if this is accurate, of course, it's interesting. It's interesting, sort of the internal politics, right? The version of politics that we don't get to see. It's interesting how that is playing itself through. And there's one more point I think we should bring up, and that is that Zelensky is not courting the entire global South. There is a key player in the global South that was shunned during the G7, and that is
Brazil.
Brazil. Yeah, it's Brazil.
Yes. It was. Yeah. Why don't you tell the story about Zelensky not showing up?
Not showing up.
Which to me personally, it's an insult. It's an insult. That's an insult. That's a diplomatic insult. Why would you not show up for the meeting that you're supposed to have with a head of state? It doesn't matter. You like the Lula da Silva or not. It's irrelevant. He is a head of state. So you show the courtesy. That's at least a diplomatic courtesy. And I am starting to be convinced that was he Zelensky ordered not to show up? Otherwise, how would you explain this?
Right.
And what's missing from all this is that Zelensky doesn't understand that Brazil is well received throughout global South. What Zelensky did is he shot himself in the foot by stooding up Lula. That didn't make sense.
So let me share with you guys the video of President Lula da Silva basically calling Zelensky out for not showing up.
Eles marcaram uma agenda com o Zelensky às 15h15. Às 15h15 nós recebemos um recado de que o Zelensky estava atrasado. E eu atendi o presidente do Vietnã. Demorou quase 1 hora o atendimento do presidente do Vietnã. E nesse aspecto o Zelensky não veio. É isso que aconteceu. O espaço de discutir a guerra não é no G7, nem é no G20. É no prédio das Nações Unidas.
All right, what do you think of that, David?
It's very, very interesting. I mean, I didn't understand, don't speak Portuguese, but I can just, from the tone of the voice, he's not pleased with, because it's again, it's a diplomatic insult. This is no different. I'm reminded now by what happened between President Xi and the Prime Minister of Canada. I don't know if you recall that when President Xi shared something with the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister went ahead and disclosed that too. Those are private conversation, which shows lack of respect completely, because in a diplomatic setting, you don't do that. You maintain the respect for the other head of state because that conversation was a private. And to me, it was like, and President Xi, because I remember this one, scolded the Prime Minister of Canada, and rightly so, because sometimes, as we say, you have to put the dots on the letter. So that's, to me, the same thing with President Zelensky not showing up. You could at least send your envoy or do something out of courtesy and respect for
Right.
the other head of state. Say, I'm sorry, I couldn't make it because whatever. Not showing up at all, that's just an insult, diplomatically speaking.
Well, and there's a couple of interesting things about this to me. The first is that he says Zelensky's a grown-up. Zelensky's an adult and he knows what he's doing by not showing up. And so that was particularly interesting to me, because he didn't no bones about it. He made no bones about it. He said Zelensky's an adult and he knows what he's doing. And I think that that's maybe one of the most interesting things that we've heard about Zelensky, period, is, because there is a lot of sort of wondering what Zelensky is actually doing here. What is he doing at G7? What is he really trying to get from this situation, right? And then the second is that he talks about that you can't solve, you basically can't find peace if you're not willing to come to the table. And he said that, that's what, whether that's what he really wanted to talk to Zelensky about or not, I don't know. But what he's saying that he wants to talk to Zelensky about is the ceasefire, is peace with Russia. And basically he says if the parties are not willing to come to the table to discuss peace, then that's not genuine. They don't genuinely want peace. And I think that that's probably true. And so he's calling Zelensky out on two fronts. First of all, he's telling him that he's telling the world that he knows that Zelensky knew what he was doing when he didn't show up. And that it seems to me that he's saying that Zelensky is not actually interested in coming to the table to talk about peace. Now, granted, it may be that he's not willing to come to the table to talk to Brazil specifically about peace.
Yeah.
But he's calling him out on that.
Yeah. And that becomes clear to me also that maybe he was ordered not to show up.
Mm-hmm.
That's
It's very possible.
Because the door to peace, some entities are interested in having it shut or kept shut. So that's the only way I look at it. Because if and again, this is where you think about the sovereignty of state. If this President comedian Zelensky was really a real politician and understand and being presidential, this is something you don't do. It's an insult. Really, really, really an insult. So, any final thoughts before we close this out, Elizabeth?
Just that it's interesting to me that there are so many countries now that are really sort of stepping up in their own way to request peace in this conflict. You have China that's really working to broker peace. You have the Arab Summit where they listened to both sides. You now have Brazil starting to talk about peace. If the intelligence from Seymour Kersh is correct, it looks like the countries around Ukraine are really starting to want peace. And, I was very young when the conflict with Afghanistan began. So I don't personally know or remember if there was ever a time when so many other countries wanted that conflict to end. But it seems like right now we're seeing, the United States is holding very firm to its position of absolutely not, no peace, no peace, no peace. But it seems that other countries are starting to ask for that on a global stage. And I just think that that's an interesting thing to witness. I don't know that it means, much of anything about how the course of that's going to go. And
Yeah,
you might be able to speak more to, how that went for other conflicts than I can. But I think that it's interesting.
indeed, indeed. Well, it depends again how the signs that I'm seeing is it's the conflict is going to be dragged for a while. That's the way I see it.
And I hope that's not
That's-
true, but it's
yeah,
it's very possible.
I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. And this is one incident where I wish I will be wrong.
Mm,
So
yeah.
because it will be to the benefit of everybody. So I hope it will work out. So anyway, well, we hope that you guys find this very informative. And by the way, if you like this content, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you have not done so. And we look forward to seeing you next time. As always, prepare yourself for changing world order. Till next time, guys. Bye-bye.